Hello, traders, and welcome to the weekend update here for February 23rd, 2025. Steve Gans here, sharing with you my thoughts on the market, where it's been, where it might potentially go. And last week was a little bit monumental, especially toward the latter half of the week. Now, the one thing that you will notice here that I'm doing this week that I haven't done in the past, this came from a user suggestion, and that is that I also add the QQQ. Normally, I analyze the SPX, which is the large S&P 500 index, which is mainly what I trade, and the RUT, which is the Russell 2000 index. But I thought that request was valid. So what I've actually done here is I've gone and I've exchanged the SPX index for the SPY. They move essentially the same, so there's no real difference there. Even though I trade the SPX is about 10 times the size of the SPY, and they move in sync with each other. The same is true of the Russell 2000 and the IWM. So I've swapped out the RUT, R-U-T, for IWM, and then I've added in the QQQs. So I'm going to go through those three key indexes. Now, the S&P and the Qs largely tend to move similar to each other, as we'll see, but I think it's different enough that it warrants having that alternate perspective or that additional perspective in there as well. The first thing I want everyone to notice here is that in the SPX, we see that we had rallied back to our prior all-time highs here, and then we had a big drop on Friday. Now, in last week's weekend update, you'll probably remember that I said that we were hitting that resistance area again, and it also was essentially the 50% line of this channel, and that I was favoring that we would probably get a drop. Now, breakout was another option that I considered, where we just break higher here. We started to do that on Wednesday, but then Thursday brought a little more question into the market, and then Friday was a pretty significant sell-off. A couple things with that sell-off. I did state last week that if we sold off, I would expect to sell off right to essentially where we did, with a possibility of even going a little bit lower, maybe even down to this channel, or possibly even down to this prior support resistance area here. So there could potentially be more downside coming up this next week. I will say this sell-off felt a little bit different. It was a little bit broader in scope. More things were selling off than had sold off previously. We had a pretty high volume bar here in that sell-off as well. And many times when you get that increased volume in a move, whether it's an up move or a down move, that can foretell what might be coming in the not too distant future. So right now, SPY, I'm neutral largely on it. We are still in a long-term uptrend, but it is starting to feel a little bit toppy because, again, we've hit these tops now 1, 2, 3, 4, essentially 4 or 5 times. In the past, those resistance areas, we hit them twice and then popped through. Here, we just hit it once and then popped through. So in prior areas where this has happened, we haven't bounced our heads quite as much off those all-time highs. So that's a little bit of concern. However, if we take a look at our indexes here, let me turn off my... However, if we come in and we look at the volatility on these indexes, so I go from the SPY and I look specifically at the VIX, which is the volatility index, we can see over here that it was elevated a little on Friday, but not hugely. So that's a little bit favorable for us, maybe stabilizing and or potentially bouncing. Now let's take a look at the Qs. So Qs, similar thing. I did come in, I drew some support and resistance lines. In the Q as well, of course, it did rise above the channel in a couple locations here in the past, but the channel is designed to incorporate the bulk of the movement in a symbol, not all movement necessarily. And we can see that pullback line here did come back although I wasn't reviewing this last week, but it did come back into what I might consider a support area. The main support is all the way down here. So Qs, if we continue falling, Qs can fall quite a ways here. They can drop maybe 10% before they finally start to hit some level of support. Of course, the Qs bumped their heads a second time on all-time highs as well and rolled down off of that. And we had an increased volume in the Qs as well. So again, that also foretells maybe a little bit more down potential move. But let's see what the volatility is like on the Qs. So the volatility is up a little bit in the Qs, but not hugely up yet. So again, not overly concerning right now, but the first couple days of this week are going to tell us a lot, I think. Then when we get into the IWM, again, I formally reviewed the Russell, the RUT, we can see that it also, in last week's weekend update, I said it's definitely hitting resistance here, and it was looking weaker. It wasn't making higher highs, or it wasn't even coming up and hitting that resistance area anymore. So it felt a little bit weaker, and I said if it falls, it could potentially fall out the bottom of this channel. But we do have another, what I would call, uptrending line that connects these various dots here. And it's entirely possible that it has seen its drop at this point. This green line right here is a fairly large resistance area as well, at around 215 on the IWM, which again is the symbol for the Russell index. And if I come in and take a look at the volatility, the RVX, which is the index for the Russell, again, didn't really make higher highs. So the volatility here is actually more in a downtrending channel, which again is a positive for this thing stabilizing, maybe even starting to move its way back up a little bit. So overall, I'm definitely neutral. While we are in a long-term uptrend still in all of the main indexes, we certainly had some pretty significant concerns or some pretty significant sell-offs coming in this week, and the sell-off was broader than it's been in the past. So again, this week, what I'm looking for, I suspect we might get a little bit further down movement, maybe down to this trend line. Have to see how that holds. I think there's probably better than a 50% chance of that. Probably a 30% chance that we might rally back up here, and then we'll have to see how this is treated. I don't see that probably happening in a day, probably 2-3 days if it does. And then maybe a small percent chance that we break to a new high. But I think the chances of breaking to a new high are pretty diminished right now in our current market conditions. I think we need to see a little more what I'll call backing and filling, where the market kind of chops around down in this area, maybe a week or two, then makes another run on these highs, and then hopefully we'll pop through at that point. If we do make another run on the highs, still don't pop through to those all new highs, then I think we may be due for some potential larger down moves. If you like this sort of content, if you find this helpful, please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe. That tells me that I'm hitting the mark here. And please always feel free to give me comments. Again, a prior viewer gave me the comment of why not add the QQQs in here. So I thought about that, looked at it, and decided, yeah, that's a good suggestion, and I added them. So please feel free to give me any feedback. I always look at all that feedback. Thanks so much for checking in here this week on February 23rd.